He's off his meds. He's erratic. Father, what do I do?
Every film you make is personal, right? But the origins of this one are particularly fucking wild. Joshua, can you explain how an especially formative childhood experience led to the exorcism 50 years later?
Well, I was probably conceived during the press tour of The Exorcist. And now I strangely live on the same beach where my parents lived in the release of the movie, talking about The Exorcist, but really about the exorcism.
Mm-hmm.
My brain is a little bit blown at the moment, but destiny's destiny. What are you going to do about it? I am where I am. I mean, some of this is my fault. Some of it's just fate, I guess. I know. I did this to myself. It was, Kevin Williamson and I were talking one day about wanting to collaborate. He was clearly a huge hero of ours, especially as an out queer person growing up in the 90s. I had so much admiration for him, as did Mark. And, he's like, I love the Final Girls. It's going to be a cult classic, but I really think let's make a even bigger movie and let's do some horror elements. And I was like, gosh, okay, why don't I tell the story about the weird stories behind the making of The Exorcist? But not make it about The Exorcist. And that's and I brought this to Mark, and Mark was at first reticent. And
like, no.
And because The Exorcism movies in general, for both of us, are not our favorite subgenre of horror, right?
An overused word, patriarchal, but they're always about, like some vulnerable woman who is too dumb to like avoid, being taken over by a malevolent force, and a strong man with a collar and a cassock needs to rescue her. And they treat the church as this sort of cast iron Teflon, source of salvation only, and instead of the extremely complicated entity that we know it to be. And then, all the reasons to say no ended up being like, oh, well, if we subvert all that shit, maybe that's kind of the reason to say yes.
And look, my relationship with my dad was really complicated, and, he died very prematurely, and he struggled a lot with addiction. He was a genius, but I think very much clouded in his own incredible mind, but also his own compulsions. And I think so much of that was, people say, what was he cursed? What cursed events happened to him while making The Exorcist? And I kind of always think about fame was his biggest curse, that never quite escaped the shadow of this colossal movie that was, bigger than most events we can understand in today's pop culture, because at that time there were not a lot of things that everyone talked about. Today we have so many microclimates and ways to experience different genres and different arts and different music. But then it was like there was only one thing that everyone talked about, right? And The Exorcist was this juggernaut comet that hit the planet. Honestly, people were waiting in lines every day and bringing their lunch to the theaters. I mean, they were literally sitting there having full days in the theater watching the movie on a loop. I mean, it had that. I mean, could you imagine if that happened today? We're too apathetic or too, pilled out to like be able to have those experiences. And I feel like people it's just different. And I think that kind of enormous fame and enormous was just too much for some kid, basically from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who like maybe a year or two before was selling his plasma to help support the family. So I think in certain ways, it was very hard for him to escape that, among other challenges. And I don't blame The Exorcist, but I think that fame is a very complicated demon. And I was interested to look into that and also talk about the very hard relationship he and I had. And the very, in the first half of my life with my dad, it was very difficult seeing him very much mirroring, I think, elements that are in Anthony and Exorcism. And I wanted to talk to Mark about that. And I was hoping Mark would be willing to go down the journey and say, can we explore this together? I know it's not your dad, but I know you didn't have the perfect relationship with your dad either, as amazing as your relationship is now. Always the early parts are always the hardest sometimes. And I think that I was like, let's make a movie about bad dads or dads we have issues with.
Yeah.
And I was like, can you go down this very dark, complicated road with me? Would you be willing to?
And I think that, like, especially looking back on it now, because like you said earlier, just in another interview, you figure out what a movie is about or why you made it. over time. Looking at the movie now, like, I think the real central horror of the movie for me anyway is about Ryan realizing that her father is not this sort of punching bag that she can be the child for the rest of her life, that she can act out by not refusing to call him by his, preferred name, dad, and keep him at arm's length and sort of, and keep him cornered in a sense for, his past transgressions, but rather, see him as human, as a really vulnerable, damaged person who is in serious crisis. And I think over the course of the time that it's taken for this movie to come out, I think personally, for me anyway, I think I've had to, come to terms with the fact that, like, oh yeah, I guess maybe that's what I was working out a little bit in this, was the idea that, our parents are people, and, what's difficult in a relationship with your parents sometimes gets healed, not because of something they do, but of how you change and how you approach them and how you find more compassion for what's flawed and imperfect about them, because at the end of the day, they're doing the best they can. Wow, this is not where I expected this.
He's like, it's a horror movie, guys.
No, my wife is a therapist, so I hear all sorts of things coming from the other side of the door. No, as one of your characters says, like, all kinds of messed up shit happened on the set of The Exorcist. Were you guys? Is it in the back of your minds that you're tempting fire? Were you guys? Was there any part of you worried that something would happen on the set? Did anything happen on the set?
I think a lot of complicated things happen on the set, but I think they were more human folly and just egos and challenges that just sort of befall any kind of movie. It's always a challenge. And I think the biggest hill to climb on this process was the creative process and trying to keep the movie rooted in what we've been talking about thematically, and to keep the movie authentic about our intentions to make this movie, which are the relationships, the sort of the past trauma. I think there was a conversation at one point about jettisoning all of that, about Russell's past, and making the movie about something else. And that to me was,
the demon's here because he's trying to get to someone else, because he's just like, and it's just like,
and then we were like, well, that movie's already been done 1,000 times. I mean, look, we had to fight a lot for those things to stay in the soul of the movie, because they wanted to excise them. And I think you have to be at a certain point, you really have to fight with all your might. Believe enough in your vision that you're willing to put yourself on the line.
Not to mention keeping the girls queer.
Not
just like,
that was a fight.
Also a struggle at some point. And so I think those were the biggest hurdles, honestly. And I guess cursed is a relative term, because making movies can be a cursed experience, because and every movie is, I think, at some degree a war with oneself, with others, to try to get your vision to the finish line.
There are so many meta aspects to the film that I really appreciated. I mean, down to the casting of Russell Crowe, who there are certain lines he has about, read the headlines. Russell Crowe has made headlines in his past. He seems like a very intense person. Is he? What is a day like on set with Russell Crowe? Is he intimidating to direct?
VIP, very intense person, is a pretty good way to put it.
I've never heard that.
I've never heard it either, but I think Kevin just coined it.
I mean, he is, look, I've had the privilege of growing up and getting access to some incredibly talented people in the world, and who've been incredibly inspiring. And more often than not, I think those larger than life personalities do what they do because they've been cut from a cloth that's tattered and ripped, and there's a tremendous amount of pain and
stress from being that famous for that long,
and then add fame to it. I think that with Russell, he's such an incredible maestro of his instrument and work. And I think that I don't get intimidated by a lot of people. I don't think I was intimidated by him. I just saw Volcano in front of me every day. And I just knew that this is part of his genius, and we just have to walk carefully around it and carefully guide this very powerful natural guy, because his talent is clearly not overly trained. I think it's raw talent. I don't think this is someone who's like spent 10 years at the RADA Academy learning to do Shakespeare. I don't think that's what interests him. I mean, he might love Shakespeare, but I think you're dealing with someone whose talent is just so from the hip that it's not intimidating. It's just, I don't know where the lava is going to come out.
Yeah.
And I think you're just going to have to just carefully manage it
Yep.
and bring that to the screen.
There's a great director, James Bridges, who once said about, working with Deborah Winger, who was famous, back then, famous, quote unquote, difficult, which is just like, oh, she was a woman who said what was on her mind, But he said, when you work with nice, you get nice, but when you work with sparks, you get fire. And,
Well,
that's Russell in a nutshell.
And Russell challenged, I can speak for myself, Russell challenged me and taught me a lot about filmmaking, because clearly he's worked with some of the greats. And he's made way more movies than I have. And I learned a lot from him, and I realized, holy shit, I'm not prepared for this. But that's how every director feels. You face that darkness every morning. You're like, I'm not ready for this, but you're never ready.
Yeah.
I guess it's like
all you can do is prepare.
It's like what they say about having kids. It's like you're never prepared, no matter how many film schools you go to or how many parent-child classes you take. It's always just baptism by fire.
Yeah, so I imagine you probably didn't use the same methods as your on-screen director Adam Goldberg did to coast his performance out of Russell.
No.
When you're making a film about the making of a film, are you just shooting around your own film set and shooting your own crew? Are you building a set around this set and like still hiring extras to play the crew? I'm so fascinated about the idea of filming a film set and how much of real life is bleeding into fiction.
I'm having dizzy flashbacks.
I was like, oh God, that.
Who's crew? Who's an extra?
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's what I kept wondering.
And that was cool in a way, right? I mean, we chose specifically to make the crew on the set feel like a Kubrick set. So it felt like an intimate family that was making the movie and not a large crew. So we tried to keep it that Adam Goldberg was an auteur who had a very select amount of people allowed on the set. I think that some people may go like, what, they didn't have enough money for more extras or atmosphere? And I was like, no, that was a conscious choice to keep the set intimate of the movie within the movie.
Mm-hmm.
That helped us have some visual distance from what was real, but it was interesting because I think in some ways it added to the experience of making the movie and the kind of fun of it and bringing our own experiences of making the movie into the movie within the movie. And look, there are so many scenes of the movie within the movie that I wish we could have put in the movie, to be honest, like shot it. We did shoot those scenes because I love that kind of stuff. I love like those endless scenes in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that Quentin has. I love the stuff of the TV show in the movie. I just find that interesting.